Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. From wherever you're joining us, we are on a topic that is so relevant in an increasingly complex world. And we have, I would call, the world's greatest simplifier, Margaret Molloy, Chief Marketing Officer of Sigel+Gale. Thank you for joining us this morning, Margaret.
Truly a pleasure, Harry, and happy Friday after a busy week.
I know I chose the background as well, thinking we should cheer people up. It's got a little bit of a Sergeant Pepper's band feel to it, and I thought it'll be a nice way to introduce you to people. So let's start off the conversation. So obviously people know you, they know your thought leadership. Walk us a little bit through how you got associated with simplicity first, and then we'll jump into the simplicity as an idea itself.
Excellent. And thanks again for the invitation. To remind everyone, I am the Global Chief Marketing Officer at Sigel+Gale. Sigel+Gale is a strategic brand strategy, design, and experience firm. I'm joining you this Friday morning from New York City. I'm privileged to have colleagues around the world, LA, New York, of course, San Francisco, Dubai, London, and beyond. And our company was started, I think you know this, Harry, over 50 years ago, based on a very basic premise, and that is that simple is smart. And that premise informs the strategies we work with our clients on, the designs, the language we choose to support our clients in building brands. We are privileged to have some of the world's leading companies as clients. And our point of view is predicated on simplicity.
Perfect. And at this point, what I will do is I will also bring out our chat box. And if all the audience they want to have questions for Margaret or comments, if you type in your comments on the live stream page, either on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, those comments would feature on the screen, and we will definitely take them up in between or towards the end of the session. So, Margaret, let me start off with the first basic question. It looks simple enough, but we know it is not. Why simplicity?
Well, let's maybe begin by defining simplicity, because very often it's one of these terms that can be misunderstood. For us at Sigel+Gale, we classify a brand experience as simple when it is at the intersection of clarity and surprise. Now, the clarity can be quite intuitive. For an experience to be simple, it must be easy for the user, the customer, the constituent to understand. The communication is easy, and it's clear how one interacts with the brand. The notion of surprise is also important because that is contributing the freshness. If a brand experience is merely simple, it runs the risk of being dull. So you need that element of surprise. So that's the definition. Simplicity happens at the intersection of clarity and surprise. As a very practical matter, there are a number of dimensions to simplicity. So when we assess how simple a brand is, we look at attributes like utility, clear to understand, consistency, transparency, and this beauty element, which translates into the freshness. So that's the context. I think you hinted at it very much in your introduction, this notion of how timely it is right now. At Sigel+Gale, as I mentioned earlier, it has been our point of view for over 50 years. In the last 2 years, it has extraordinary resonance because the context we are all living in is a world that's more complex. The pandemic, I would argue, has put a cognitive tax on all of us. So the brands that deliver simpler experiences are being rewarded by customers.
It's fascinating because the way I came across your research and your work was many years ago when I was in Zurich. I teach agility, I believe in it, I bring it to life with different companies. And I always said simple is agile, right? Till I came across simple is smart and I came across your research. And then I started studying these companies as part of the research and the simplicity portfolio. Talk us through some of these companies, what this portfolio is, and how has this portfolio changed over years?
Excellent question. And specifically, what you are referencing is our world's simplest brands study. I see some friends here on the chat. So, if anyone would like to put in a link to World's Simplest Brands, everyone can go through it and look at it in great detail. This is a study we've been conducting for over 10 years now. Recently issued the ninth issue of the study, and the study is essentially a survey of over 15,000 people across 9 countries. And we ask consumers to rank brands on their simplicity relative to their industry. And we compile a ranking based on the performance of over 500 brands across the globe. And you reference this, the portfolio, and that's a really interesting concept because essentially what we have done over the period of the study, we've said, let's look at the global brands, the top 10 performers, according to the consumers who are being surveyed, and let's do a basket of stocks, the 10 stocks, an index, if you will, and chart that index against the standard stock market indices. And what is extraordinary is year after year, the top 10 brands in this basket, we call it the World's Simplest Brands portfolio, far exceed the performance of all of the indices. And I suppose when you think about that, it's somewhat interesting when you might ask, well, what's your takeaway, Margaret, from that? My takeaway is that Wall Street or the capital markets also reward brands who deliver simple experiences. And it's not just our research. I recently came across the work of Nomura, the investment bank, and they did a marvelous study based on their ability, and you will appreciate this, to crunch big data. And they looked at the language CEOs were using when in their earnings calls. And they observed a similar trend. The simpler, the plainer the language the CEO used to express the ideas around the company at the earnings call, the better the performance of the stock.
And I always, watch you, listen to you talking about being a simplifier, right? So I guess that is where the leadership connection happens between a business and a consumer, and the ability to continuously simplify those experiences or even the messaging for that matter. Now, when we look at that portfolio of companies, and when you ask consumers what constitutes simplicity for them, what are those metrics or questions? What do consumers respond to when they measure simplicity in these brands?
We typically ask the consumers to evaluate brands across a number of metrics: ease of understanding, consistency of experience, usefulness or utility, and freshness. Those are the typical dimensions, if you will. Now, when you aggregate performance, we ask essentially the economic questions. In other words, how much would you be willing to pay for a simpler experience? And lo and behold, if you take a look at the study, I see Madeline King posted it, you will see that a significant difference in terms of people are willing to pay more for simpler experiences. The other economic benefit is they are willing to reward brands that provide a simpler experience with their loyalty. And how we get at that is a version of the NPS question. In other words, they are more willing to recommend a brand that provides a simpler experience. And then we look at the stock performance and we see Wall Street rewards brands for simplicity. And then we do some, I think, really interesting calculus. We look at the performance of brands and marry that, if you will, to consumers' willingness to pay more. And we recognize, my goodness, brands are leaving money on the table by not simplifying.
I was in conversation with Tom Peters a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned about the pacemaker he has from Medtronic. And he says it's so breathtakingly simple for such a complicated health device that he would be gladly paying more. But you and I know brands miss it. So why do brands have poor design?
Design is certainly one aspect of it. Another component is ambiguity around their communication. So if you look at the different touch points, you have the design component, you have the verbal component, and most important of all, the experience component at every touch point. So if you look at Tom and his reference to the pacemaker, that's the physicality of the product and the insight that goes into prioritizing which features to highlight, the aesthetic of it, and that balance of aesthetic and utility and communication. I think there are a number of reasons as to why complexity is more dominant than simplicity from a brand standpoint. One of them is growth. As companies grow, their portfolios expand, and inherent in that is more complexity. Another component is often the colleagues who are responsible for the product or the brand experience are very often different colleagues from the colleagues who are responsible for the marketing and the messaging. And you can have that disconnect. So the marketing is purporting one experience and communicating that, but it doesn't map to the user's experience. And then you have that dissonance, which is the antithesis of simplicity. A third of the many reasons I would offer is leadership. Again, you hinted at that very wisely in the beginning. Simplicity has to come from the top. It has to be a value that is rewarded internally within organizations. And I know Tom's training and many trainings we all had at MBA school and great institutions like the ones that you work at. Sometimes we reward complexity. We reward nuance in language. We reward vernacular that's really jargon. And that's the training. And people think, oh my gosh, if I'm smart, I must use big words or jargon. And then that translates into the product, the marketing, the communications. But in actuality, the consumer is not rewarding that because consumers are harried. And we noticed this very much in the last couple of years of the study, this notion of just you're putting too much of a cognitive load. What Tom Peters referenced in that lovely anecdote that you've shared is that he didn't have excessive cognitive load in the experience in using that product. And that's something companies have to be intentional about because left to its own devices, simplicity isn't natural in a corporate context.
I'm going to put up a question for you. This is from a gentleman called Rajan Kalia. He's one of our course leaders at Caltech Executive Education, and he's now creating a new course called The New World People Manager. And how do people managers operate in an increasingly complex paradigm, right? Can you share from your experience which brands have been simplest for the past 20 years or so, and what is their secret sauce?
Yes. And the good news is that link has all the details and you can go in and interrogate it by various search criteria. This past study, the world's simplest brand is Google. And Google has pretty consistently been a top performer. They have delivered on their mission of organizing the world's information. They have very much achieved this notion of utility. They're very useful, as we know. And look at that aesthetic. When you go on Google, look how pared down that experience is. Another brand that's consistently performed well is Amazon. Think about Amazon, the creators of that one click. From an experience perspective, they innately understand the consumer is there with a purpose in mind and they remove friction. Remember when removing friction was the vernacular in Silicon Valley? Well, the brands that get that right are simplifiers. So this idea of removing friction. Another top performer is Netflix. And Netflix does a wonderful job of, through big data, I'm sure, anticipating our needs, recommending to us products, or in their case, entertainment, that meet our needs as well. So those are three brands in that sector. But it's also really interesting to look in sectors that might be deemed more complex. Fast food, for example, really difficult to get fast food right. McDonald's has consistently outperformed. And that's partly a function of the simplicity of the menu and the genius around from the Happy Meal to the packaging of the menus. And another thing that might surprise you could be some people will say to me, well, look, Margaret, Google, Amazon, somewhat newer companies, perhaps, not as much legacy challenges and a relatively less complex industry. And then I would say, fair enough, but look outside category. Look, for example, at airlines. Airlines really interesting, arguably one of the most complex categories. And to me, when I look inside a sector like that, I try to look at what is the difference in performance of the top performer to those who are performing poorly. I'll give you a very concrete airlines example. Southwest consistently does rather well for its category in the Simplicity Index, and Ryanair does very poorly. And they both have the same business model. They are budget or low cost carriers. So, what's the difference? I think at the heart of it, in the case of Southwest, there's transparency. You know how much you're going to pay, and that's pretty clear. With Ryanair, consumers tell us that these hidden charges, which is the opposite of transparency. So you go in, there are fees, and that's an example of how, even if you're in a complex category, you're not relegated to be a complex company if you embrace these principles of simplicity. Harry, I've lost your audio.
So what is fascinating in the conversation about simplicity from a consumer perspective is we also see organizations losing simplicity as they go inside the company, right? So if you look at a dollar spent and time invested in creating outstanding experiences for consumers or customers, it is not proportional to the time invested or the dollar spent internally for employees to stay customer centric, right? I would probably argue that the unionization efforts of Starbucks are in fact to a large extent the complexity that is created due to high degree of customization of drinks, but also the complexity it creates between serving a customer in the store, in the drive-in, through the app, and all of the new digital dexterity that the company has had. So how would you account for the internal quotient of simplicity in these companies?
Really interesting. And what you're touching on there is what we in branding talk about as brand architecture. In other words, how products and features are organized in the physical setting of the retail setting, or even often more evident on the website. And this is huge, for example, in the B2B industry, where someone comes on and they just can't find what they're looking for. From my work in terms of understanding organizational design, often that is a byproduct of the incentives and the organizational construct internally. So you have people in product marketing who are in charge of one thing, and you have another group in product marketing who have another set of goals. And ultimately, this alphabet soup is what transpires for the customer. That goes right back to what we said at the introduction. It has to be a value. I know at Sigel+Gale, from our perspective, we evaluate all of our colleagues and ourselves every year on how we are simplifiers. In other words, how do we make it easier for our clients and our colleagues to be successful? And that has to come from the top. And then when it's done elegantly, it's embedded in the incentives and reward systems and how people are promoted and how people are elevated at an organization.
There is an interesting question from Maulik Chandarana. So he's talking about B2B. I think you alluded to B2B brands in a short while ago, but he's also talking about SaaS products and technology as a sector. Would you have insights on either B2B or technology service kind of products or services?
Oh, absolutely. Now, this particular study, there's the link in the chat, is consumer based, but we work extensively with B2B companies. I'd provide a couple of thoughts. One, and I'm sure the questioner shares this perspective. So many B2B companies now are SaaS based. In other words, their business model is predicated on two very important things. It's predicated on people using the product for renewals because it requires renewals. So that means you need to design a customer experience that's simple, that's intuitive to drive usage. Back in the day when a lot of technology was more on premise, that wasn't as big a factor. So there's the business model factor that so much is subscription based now and therefore requires renewal. And the second factor is the how many SaaS brands are actually start as a freemium. So in other words, that first trial is gratis. So the experience has to be simple to drive usage in order to motivate the user to upgrade to the paid offering. So those are very compelling reasons at the business model level as to why simplicity is important. I think more broadly, the idea around building a brand in B2B is also vital. Think about who the buyers are in the B2B context right now, demographically. So many of the people who are now making purchase decisions for technology are people who grew up with Amazon. So their expectations of the experience, the whole sales process, as well as the product, are formed on the basis of their consumer experience. So they are measuring that B2B company against best in class consumer experiences, and they have an expectations of simplicity and ease of use.
That was brilliant. And I want to go to one more question and then I'll go to the correlation between culture and simplicity. But I do want to highlight from our own Tracelyn, what are the hallmarks of clarity and surprise?
Well, let me first tell you, Tracelyn, what it's not. It's not about being reductive. A lot of folks think simplicity is about boiling something down to to something that's sort of thoughtless and lacks rigor and lacks beauty and lacks freshness. So that's the first kind of myth to dispel. Clarity is about when you experience something, be it language, or I'll come back to Tom Peters and the pacemaker, that it's intuitive, that you immediately get it. And you often have this reaction of, oh, right, I wish I had thought about that. I wish I had thought of it. That's so right on point. I wish I had thought of it. So that's the hallmark. Another component of it, such a beautiful question, Tracelyn. Another component is consistency. So every time you come back, it meets your expectations. It's the experience, particularly we live in an experience economy. So every time we have an experience, it is consistent. Usefulness is the other hallmark I love to think about. The B2B question earlier also, for which this is a great notion. You ask yourself, is it actually useful? That can be a really powerful filter to decide the addition of a feature or the addition of, if you will, the traditional sort of bells and whistle concept. And companies get that wrong because they are so consumed by the features and the gee whiz factor, they often neglect that filter of, is it actually useful?
That was brilliant. And I want to ask you a question about Uniqlo, Japanese brand, makes it into the top 10, right? We know
Yes.
that inherently the Japanese culture by itself isn't necessarily as simple as is it we understand it to be. So, what is the play between these companies that are originating from either United States or from Japan or from China? I haven't seen, for example, when I looked at the top 10 brands in India, I didn't see much of an Indian presence in those brands. I still saw Google, I still saw McDonald's, YouTube, right? So, is there something in these countries that is creating these brands that contributes to being simple?
Really interesting question. I think what you're observing is globalization, right? Because so many companies that are successful in one market strike a chord and suddenly they solve a need that is universal and applies to other countries. So whether it's the Googles or the Amazons, depending on the regulatory framework. Let's spend a minute on Uniqlo because I find that brand really interesting. When you go into that store, I see two aspects of simplicity that are very compelling. And it's not merely what I see, of course, it's reflected in the data. The first is a lot of the apparel that they make available are basics. So it's a standard t shirt, it's a basic sweater. So that's kind of number one, right? The product inherently is basic. However, they don't stop there. They have done some really interesting collaborations, for example, with Disney. So you'll go in and you may see a famous Disney character on your t-shirt, and they will be limited editions. So what I love about their interpretation of simplicity is they get that balance right between utility and surprise, the kind of surprise that keeps coming back. I think your cultural exploration question is a very interesting one, and it warrants more research to get to the heart of it. We can have opinions, I suppose, culturally as to which cultures reward or glorify simplicity. I'm not an expert on Japan personally, but I do have an appreciation for that aesthetic. And I think a lot of the cultural nuance of a brand can be in the aesthetic, which speaks to the beauty component. Simplicity isn't easy, Harry. And I think the genius of the great simplifiers is they know what to strip away and what to leave behind. Back to Jocelyn's question of it's not about being reductive, it's about knowing what to strip away, what to remain. And at its core, that means you deeply understand your customer and know what matters to them.
I'm going to ask you a little bit of a fun question. When brands see themselves in the bottom 10, do they call you?
Um, some do, some do. Often we call them to invite them to learn more. But I think your question's fun, but it also speaks to a more fundamental idea that some brands think simplicity is not within their reach because we're an inherently complex category. Others say, of course, we did well. Simplicity is core to what we do. And if you listen to the CMO of Google, for example, you will know from listening to them simplicity. They may use different vernacular, they may use ease of understanding or making it easy for customers. It's core to their ethos. I believe over this pandemic period, certainly from the conversations we're having with brands, there is more and more interest in this. So it might have been a novelty some time ago or a luxury even to make things simple. Now it's becoming a necessity. But not everyone can do it well. It's the genius of the simplifiers, as I said, is that judgment. We have colleagues, for example, who are extraordinary writers and their expertise is in plain language. And that's a rarefied skill set. We have others who are experts in data collection and research, and part of their genius is the collection, but the other part is how they present that data to the client. So it is a skill and one that one has to invest in.
Got it. And when we talk about brands, like obviously we discussed Uniqlo, which is a single category apparel company. When we talk about companies like Google, they're into multiple areas of business, right? So it's almost, so is it possible that a company that has mastered simplicity in a one type of service or a solution may not be able to replicate it in another because they were not very successful with, for example, with a pixel phone, right?
Mm.
Or with a tablet design. Whereas you see companies like Apple being able to be more consistent, is one of the words that you use, whether in the design of an AirPod, a tablet, a laptop, or a streaming service, or an interface like music, for example. So is it at all possible that simplicity goes missing when they go into areas that's not their natural comfort zone?
I would probably venture to say no, because I think it's more at the cultural level. It's if we reward simplicity, if it's part of our incentives, part of our MO, it doesn't mean you won't make mistakes for other reasons or experiments won't fail. But for example, you referenced Apple. I think one of the reasons why Apple has sometimes not done as well as it might in our simplicity index is because of the adapters. So consumers tell us the Apple experience, yeah, that's wonderful. But what's with all these changing phone adapters? And when I buy one piece of hardware, my adapter isn't interoperable. So I guess the macro point here is you must continually be vigilant to keep simplicity top of mind. It's not a attribute that survives in a context of complexity, in a context of complacency rather. And I think the other notion is, guess what? Consumers continue to raise the bar. So the simplicity they experience from one brand now sets the expectations for another in a different category. So I think it's largely cultural and it's about diligence.
Is it easier to be simple in a consumer brand because consumers love the feel of it, the energy of it, the enthusiasm of it, because you have much more freedom to articulate what your experience stands for as compared to a B2B brand? I do fully understand and I agree that the concept of simplicity is equally important and
Mm.
equally applicable, right? But is it easier to create a simplicity based experience in consumer products or services as compared to B2B products and services?
I think they're different. I wouldn't evaluate them on the same sort of spectrum. The challenge with consumer is the proliferation of product and services in every category and the broad comparison set and the continuous innovation. So those are challenges that are in consumer. In B2B, it's another set of challenges. It's sometimes the nuance of the offering and the actual problem it's solving is inherently very complex and the solution can be very complex. But I don't believe it's more difficult because at its core, if you boil it down to what's most important, it's about solving a person's need. Whether the need is in a consumer setting or whether the need is in doing their jobs in a B2B setting, guess what? It's still people. And the expectations may be different, the application may be different, but they still only have 24 hours in the day. They still only have a certain cognitive capacity they want to invest in your offering. So it's just different. I think it's imminently doable, simplicity on a different plane in B2B models. And we've seen brands who do it very well.
Last year, late last year in quarter four, I went to the Los Angeles Auto Show and I spent an entire day just looking at what these new electric vehicle companies are trying to accomplish in terms of experience. Obviously, now there's a new rush for battery design, there's software, and the car becomes the platform to do other things. But in the index or in the simplest brands, I don't see car companies knocking the doors because they are really innovative, right? If you look at Rivian, Tesla, Fisker, if you look at Ford Bronco, what they've done with it, F-150 with the new design, with the new minibus of Volkswagen, that's my picture with the new minibus ID. It's called Buzz ID. So why are the car companies not in contention to be simple enough?
It's an interesting question. And I think we have a category so you can go in and look at the we look at 25 different industries. Auto is one of them. I think the one this year that actually had a significant jump was Nissan. So take a look at Nissan. They had a significant improvement. I'm not sure I know why. My hypothesis is the brands that perform best in our index are ones that people consume with high frequency. In other words, you use Google pretty frequently, you may go to McDonald's, you travel, etc. Whereas auto is a more considered purchase and one you do less frequently. So that's my hypothesis in terms of our index and why they are less high achieving. But obviously, the category is complicated. I think what's interesting about auto is this opportunity for beauty and that aspect of beauty and the aesthetic. But also, I saw a questioner come in the chat asking about themes. Another theme of the brands that have done well this past study is the awareness around the environment and how they're leaning into eco themes, We saw that in apparel. We see that in, for example, IKEA, that has a buyback program for its furniture. So that's something where you can bring simplicity to life in how you communicate these programs that you are building at the brand level.
I'm going to take you a little bit on your own personal journey, right? So, you shared a beautiful interview that you did, and then you published it, and it basically says my American dream and the story for St. Patrick's Day. There are so many elements of it that really are touching and to be called out. So, first, I want to start with your great aunt who did the journey, uh, uh, very sadly, on the Titanic, and many years and years later you fly across to US for opportunity, and you did a beautiful correlation. Can you explain to our audience that nuance of what you've written in that?
Well, thank you. And I refer our audience to a post I wrote, which was essentially duplicating an article that we had published in Authority magazine. So they were generous enough to provide me an opportunity to tell my immigrant story. They have some wonderful stories there. My particular experience is I grew up in Ireland, as the accent probably betrays, and the United States had no real allure to my family, which is a little unusual for Irish people. And I remember as a child hearing the story of my father's aunt, a woman by the name of Bridget Henry. And Bridget Henry, in her early 20s, traveled to the, or aspired to, traveled to the United States to be a servant in a grand house in Philadelphia. Her sister had made the journey before her. And she was able to find the funds to go to get passage to the Titanic. And unfortunately, she was one of the many who perished on that fatal journey. And that was always a story in our folklore as a family. And I thought about it often, about the unlived dream of Bridget Henry. And when my turn came in my early 20s, I had the benefit of a college education and so much more access. And I thought about her often when I made that passage. And I relate to it because, on some level, she was a metaphor for dreams that couldn't happen, but also an opening to the opportunity that I had in the United States. And when I tell that to others, I think you appreciate the story too. America is such a wonderful country, a land of immigrants, and her story resonates with me.
And you brought your brand along with that, which is wearing Irish, right? So I just couldn't understand it. I said, is Margaret a CMO or an outstanding model for a fashion brand? So as I kept looking at it, but then over a period of time, I begin to appreciate the sheer brand ambassadorship that you bring to wearing Irish and everything Irish. So talk us through your wearing Irish journey.
Thank you. And Madeline King has just posted a link. Madeline was one of my collaborators on this story. So thank you, Madeline. Um, yes, wearing Irish, really the idea behind that was there are many wonderful designers in Ireland, but it's an untold story. And in the United States, I do a lot of events and I enjoy fashion, probably a little more than the average. And I, at some point, decided, gosh, I have a platform. Why don't I wear Irish products? Because very often when you're in a public setting, you may get a compliment, or at least you bring visibility to what you're wearing. So I started doing that around St. Patrick's Month a few years back, and designers in Ireland were excited by that. And it got a lot of publicity in the country of Ireland, this idea that some lady in New York who has many fashion options would choose to wear Irish designers. Fast forward to 2018, we start with the support of a number of very generous sponsors. We hosted a competition to bring 10 top designers from Ireland to New York. And the idea behind that was to give them access and exposure. I didn't have the wherewithal to make introductions to every fashion buyer, but I knew I had a platform and I knew I was their consumer and I knew other people of a similar taste profile and similar interest. So hundreds of people in New York were treated to the wares of these fashion designers, and you can check it out on wearingirish.com. What is really interesting, though, as I look back on that effort, and I continue to post on LinkedIn and on the blog, it's this strange concept of I brought light to an untold story. And what I find most gratifying is now increasingly the media in Ireland is celebrating local designers. Because what I observed at the time is, and it's not an unusual cultural phenomena, but they were lauding the foreign designers. And it was a sort of a badge of aspiration to own a product by foreign designers. And this lady in America brought to their attention, well, my goodness, that's great. But don't forget the local talent. And I'm extraordinarily validated every time I pick up an Irish publication to see a profile of these very talented Irish designers.
Fantastic work promoting these young people across the world, and in particular, people who thought their products could never be seen by people across the seas, right? And experience what it means to build a brand. So, thank you for actually doing that. So I'm going to take you back. We just have a few minutes left. I want to pass it back to you. What would your advice be to leaders in our world today? So increasing complexity of technology, uh, highly polarized, divided society, uh, very confused values at times, right? On what to believe, what not to believe, brands that are extremely aggressive with data privacy issues. And obviously, I'm trying to give you the contrast to what great looks like. I fully realize that. But given that environment that we are trying to battle, and in your article as well, you say the goodness has to come to fore, right? How do you make goodness actually succeed in this world? What is your advice to all the leaders across the world?
It's a big question. My humble advice would be to begin by focusing on purpose. Work at identifying what is your purpose and what is the purpose of the brand you lead, and use that as a filter to inform the actions, the policies, the products, all of your activity. Second piece I would offer is focus on simplicity. Ask yourself, is the experience I'm creating for all my constituents, my employees, my partners, my users, my customers, is it simple? Is it useful? Is it solving an unmet need? Am I delivering experiences and communications in a consistent fashion? And is it beautiful? And third is spend time on reflection. So many of us in busy roles, whether leaders or individual contributors, we expend so much energy in doing. I would invite us to spend time on reflecting. Show yourself some self compassion, but always think about an action or a project in the context of what is the lesson I can extract from that experience. So, top three things.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Always a pleasure to listen to you. I've been following your work for many years, and that of Siegel and Gale, and always it's inspirational. And there are times people told me that I'm more of a brand ambassador for your research than anything else, because it's very difficult to explain to people why it is so important. And when you see an index, when you see a little bit of a quantification of a concept that is abstract, and the significance of it, correlation to economic value, consumer experience, it pops up, right? So, always an inspiration. Thank you for doing this session with me and Caltech Executive Education. I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much, and all the best and continued success with the important work Caltech Education is doing.
Thank you, Margaret.